For decades it didn't exist. Not in newspapers, not in history books, not even on maps. An entire city erased, removed from official records as if it had never been. But 70,000 people lived there, they worked there, they built their lives there. And then in 1957, disaster struck. Not an accident, not an equipment failure. A nuclear explosion caused by negligence, secrecy, and a government that prioritized weapons over people. The blast released twice the radioactive contamination of Chernobyl. The fallout spread across 23,000 square kilometers. Hundreds died immediately. Thousands more developed cancers, birth defects, and radiation sickness over the following decades. And the Soviet government said nothing. They evacuated over 10,000 people without explanation. They destroyed entire villages. They bulldozed contaminated forests and buried them, and they classified everything. For 30 years, the world didn't know it had happened. The CIA suspected. Western intelligence agencies picked up traces of radiation in the atmosphere, but the Soviet Union denied it all. It wasn't until 1989, after the fall of the Soviet regime, that the truth began to emerge. This is the story of the Kyshtym disaster, the Mayak facility, the secret city of Ozyorsk, and the nuclear catastrophe that was 100 times worse than Chernobyl in terms of long-term contamination, but was hidden from history until it was too late to help the victims. The story begins in 1945. World War II had ended. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union, desperate to catch up in the nuclear arms race, launched a crash program to develop its own nuclear weapons. They needed plutonium, and to produce plutonium, they needed reactors and reprocessing facilities. In 1948, construction began on a secret nuclear complex in the southern Urals, near the town of Kyshtym. The facility was called Mayak, which means lighthouse in Russian, but there was nothing illuminating about it. It was a factory for producing weapons-grade plutonium, and it was built in a hurry. Speed mattered more than safety. The Soviet leadership set impossible deadlines. Scientists and engineers worked under constant pressure. Stalin wanted the bomb, and he wanted it fast. Resources were unlimited, but corners were cut everywhere. Reactor designs were simplified. Safety systems were minimized. Waste disposal was an afterthought. And the workers, they were expendable. The facility was located next to a closed city called Chelyabinsk 40, later renamed Ozyorsk. Closed cities were a Soviet invention. Entire urban areas that didn't appear on maps, where access was strictly controlled and where secrecy was absolute. The people who lived there worked at Mayak. They couldn't leave without permission. They couldn't tell their families outside what they did. And they couldn't speak about the accidents. And there were accidents, many of them. From the very beginning, Mayak was a disaster waiting to happen. The reactors went critical. Radiation leaks were routine. Workers were exposed to doses that would be considered lethal by today's standards, but there were no safety regulations, no exposure limits, no protective equipment beyond basic lab coats. The scientists knew the risks, they raised concerns, and they were told to keep working or face consequences. This was Stalin's Soviet Union. Questioning orders could mean prison, or worse. The waste problem started immediately. Nuclear reprocessing produces enormous amounts of radioactive waste, highly contaminated liquids, sludge containing strontium-90, cesium-137, plutonium isotopes. This waste remains dangerous for thousands of years. It must be stored securely, isolated from the environment. Mayak had no real plan for this. In the early years, they simply dumped it. Radioactive waste was poured directly into the Teka River, which flowed through dozens of villages and eventually into the Ob River system, one of the largest in Russia. Over 76 million cubic meters of radioactive waste were dumped into the river between 1948 and 1956. 76 million cubic meters. The contamination spread downstream for hundreds of kilometers. Villages along the Teka used the river for drinking water, for irrigation, for fishing. People bathed in it. Children played in it, and they were being poisoned. Cancer rates spiked. Birth defects appeared. People developed radiation sickness, nausea, hair loss, immune collapse, but they weren't told why. Doctors knew, but they were ordered to stay silent. The villagers were diagnosed with special disease. No explanation, no treatment, just suffering and death. By 1951, even the Soviet authorities realized the river dumping had to stop. So they built storage tanks, massive steel and concrete containers buried underground, designed to hold liquid radioactive waste until it could be properly processed. But properly processed never happened. The tanks were poorly designed. Cooling systems were inadequate. Radioactive decay generates heat. Without proper cooling, the waste heats up. And one of those tanks, tank number 14, was a ticking time bomb. The cooling system failed in 1956. Maintenance was deferred because the facility was focused on meeting production quotas. The temperature inside the tank began rising, slowly at first, then faster. The waste contained nitrate salts, which are explosive at high temperatures. Sensors detected the temperature increase. Alarms were raised. Engineers recommended emergency cooling, but the decision-makers hesitated. Cooling the tank would require shutting down parts of the facility. That would delay plutonium production. That would mean missing targets, so they waited. They monitored. They hoped it would stabilize. It didn't. On September 29, 1957, at 4:20 in the afternoon, tank number 14 exploded. The temperature inside had reached over 350 degrees Celsius. The nitrate salts detonated with a force equivalent to 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The explosion blew the concrete lid off the tank, a slab weighing over 160 tons, and hurled it into the air. Radioactive waste shot hundreds of meters into the sky. A cloud of particles, dust, and vapor drifted on the wind. The explosion released approximately 20 million curies of radioactive material. For comparison, Chernobyl released about 50 million curies, but much of that was short-lived iodine-131. The Mayak explosion released long-lived isotopes, strontium-90, cesium-137, plutonium. Contamination that would persist for decades. The plume spread northeast, carried by the wind. Over the next 10 hours, radioactive fallout rained down across an area of 23,000 square kilometers, a contamination zone larger than the entire Chernobyl exclusion zone, and the Soviet government said nothing. Workers at the facility knew immediately something catastrophic had happened. The explosion was heard across the complex. Radiation alarms went off. But there was no evacuation order, not for the workers, not for the nearby city of Ozyorsk. People continued their shifts, went home, had dinner, slept. For 3 days, the government assessed the situation and debated what to do. On October 2, 72 hours after the explosion, evacuations began. Not of Ozyorsk, that would have been too visible, too hard to hide, but of the villages downwind. Over 10,000 people from 23 villages were evacuated. They were given 2 hours to pack. No explanation was provided. They were told it was temporary, a military exercise, a precautionary measure. They were loaded onto trucks and buses and driven away. They never returned. Their homes were bulldozed. Livestock was slaughtered and buried. Contaminated topsoil was scraped away and buried in pits. The villages were erased, wiped off the map. And the people were resettled in new areas, still without being told why. Many were resettled in areas that were also contaminated, just at lower levels. The explosion and the evacuations were classified as a state secret. Mayak workers were forbidden from speaking about it. Documents were stamped top secret. Maps of the contaminated zone were restricted. Medical data on the affected population was hidden. Doctors treating radiation sickness were ordered to record it as other illnesses. Death certificates listed heart disease, pneumonia, cancer, never radiation. The affected region became known unofficially as the East Urals Radioactive Trace, or EURT. It stretched over 300 kilometers long and up to 50 kilometers wide. Radiation levels in some areas exceeded 1,000 times normal background levels. The most contaminated zones were cordoned off with barbed wire and guards, but much of the area remained inhabited. Farmers continued working fields that were contaminated. Wells drew water from contaminated aquifers, and the cancer rates climbed. Leukemia, bone cancer, lung cancer. Birth defects in the next generation. Stillbirths, immune disorders. The medical evidence was overwhelming, but it was all classified, the secrecy held for decades. In the West, the disaster was unknown. In 1976, a Soviet scientist named Georges Medvedev, who had defected to the UK, published an article describing a nuclear disaster in the Urals based on fragmented reports and scientific papers that hinted at contamination in the region. Western intelligence agencies took notice. The CIA reviewed satellite imagery and environmental data. They confirmed that something had happened, but details were scarce. The Soviet government dismissed Medvedev's claims as anti-Soviet propaganda. They said no such disaster had occurred. Because the Soviet Union controlled all information from the region, the truth remained buried. It wasn't until 1989, during Glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev, that the Soviet government finally acknowledged the disaster, and even then they minimized it. They admitted there had been an accident, but they downplayed the scale, the contamination, and the casualties. The true death toll will never be known. The Soviet government never released comprehensive health data. Estimates vary widely. Some studies suggest that over 200 people died from acute radiation exposure in the immediate aftermath. Thousands more developed radiation-induced cancers over the following decades. One study estimated that by the 2000s, over 22,000 people had suffered serious health consequences from the Mayak disaster, including the explosion and the earlier river contamination. But these are estimates. The real number could be much higher. Many victims lived in remote areas. Many died without their illnesses being linked to radiation. And the government actively suppressed the data. Researchers who tried to study the health impacts were blocked. Medical records were destroyed or hidden. The victims were silenced, and many have since died, taking their stories with them. The contamination didn't stop with the explosion. The Mayak facility continued operating. It still operates today. And it continued to release radioactive material into the environment for decades. In addition to the river dumping and the tank explosion, there was another disaster in 1967. A drought dried up Lake Karachay, a lake used to store liquid radioactive waste. The lakebed, contaminated with radioactive sediment, was exposed to the wind. Dust storms carried the radioactive particles across the region, recontaminating areas and spreading contamination to new zones. Over 41,000 people were exposed. Again, no public warning. Again, the information was classified. And again, people continued living in contaminated areas, unaware of the danger. The lake was eventually filled in and covered with concrete, but the damage was done. Today, the Mayak facility is one of the most contaminated places on Earth. The surrounding region, the Teka River Basin, the EURT, Lake Karachay, contains more long-lived radioactive contamination than Chernobyl. Strontium-90, with a half-life of 29 years, remains in the soil and water. Cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, is still detectable. Plutonium, with a half-life of 24,000 years, will remain dangerous for millennia. Cleanup efforts have been minimal and inadequate. Some contaminated zones have been fenced off. Some contaminated buildings have been demolished. But much of the waste remains where it was buried in the 1950s and 60s, in shallow pits, in unlined trenches, leaking into groundwater, spreading slowly through the environment. The Russian government has allocated funding for remediation, but progress is slow. The Mayak facility is still operational, still producing plutonium and still generating waste. The focus is on managing current operations, not cleaning up the past. The people who lived through the disaster are still seeking justice. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union collapsed, victims and their families began organizing. They filed lawsuits. They demanded compensation. They demanded access to medical care and health monitoring. The Russian government acknowledged their suffering but offered minimal compensation, a few $100s per person, not enough to cover medical expenses, not enough to compensate for a lifetime of illness, for parents who died young, for children born with defects, and many claims were denied outright. The burden of proof was placed on the victims. They had to prove their illnesses were caused by radiation, but the government controlled the data, the dosimetry records, the contamination maps, the medical files, and much of it was still classified or had been destroyed. It was a Kafkaesque nightmare. The victims were told to prove something the government refused to document. International attention has been limited. Chernobyl became a global symbol of nuclear disaster. Books, documentaries, TV series. The world knows Chernobyl, but Mayak, most people have never heard of it. Why? Because it happened in a closed city. Because the Soviet government successfully covered it up for 30 years. Because by the time the truth emerged, the Cold War was ending and the world was focused on other crises. And because the victims were rural, poor, and powerless. They had no voice, no platform, no way to make the world care. The story of Mayak is a story of invisibility, of erasure, of a government that decided some lives didn't matter, and of a world that, even when it learned the truth, chose to look away. The Mayak disaster is a warning about what happens when secrecy and nuclear weapons collide. The Soviet Union prioritized the bomb over everything. Safety regulations were ignored. Workers were expendable. Entire populations were sacrificed. And the contamination they created will outlast empires. The strontium in the bones of children in the Urals, the cesium in the soil, the plutonium that will remain radioactive for 24,000 years, long after Russia, long after the Soviet Union, long after the memory of the Cold War has faded, that contamination will still be there, still dangerous, still killing. And the same pattern continues today. Nuclear facilities around the world operate in secrecy. Accidents happen and are downplayed. Contamination spreads and is hidden. Workers are exposed and told it's safe. Communities are poisoned and told it's within acceptable limits. The Mayak disaster was not unique. It was extreme, but it was not unique. In the United States, the Hanford site in Washington state produced plutonium for the Manhattan Project and the Cold War nuclear arsenal. Between 1944 and 1987, the facility released massive amounts of radioactive contamination into the air and the Columbia River. Workers were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Downwind communities, including Native American tribes, suffered elevated cancer rates. The government knew and said nothing for decades. At the Savannah River site in South Carolina, similar contamination occurred. At Rocky Flats in Colorado, plutonium contamination spread from a weapons facility to surrounding neighborhoods. The pattern is global. The Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, China. Every nuclear weapons program has left a trail of contamination and victims. And in almost every case, the truth was hidden, the victims were ignored, and accountability was never achieved. Mayak is still operational. It's Russia's primary facility for reprocessing spent nuclear fuel and producing plutonium. The Russian government has invested in upgrades and safety improvements, modern storage tanks, better monitoring systems, international oversight. But the legacy of the past remains. The contaminated zones, the radioactive waste buried in shallow pits, the people still living on contaminated land, and the secrecy. Even today, access to the Ozyorsk area is restricted. Independent researchers are not allowed. Journalists are not welcome. The Russian government controls the narrative. They admit the past disasters but insist everything is safe now. Trust us, they say. The same words the Soviet government used in 1957. The same words governments always use when they're hiding something. The victims of Mayak deserved better. They deserved to know what they were being exposed to. They deserved protective equipment, medical care, and compensation. They deserved the truth. Instead, they got silence, denial, and erasure. And their story is a reminder that nuclear disasters don't end when the explosion stops or the fire is put out. They continue for generations, in the bodies of the exposed, in the contaminated land, in the cancers that appear decades later, in the children born with defects, in the fear and trauma that never fades. Chernobyl is remembered because it couldn't be hidden. Mayak was hidden and so it's forgotten. But the contamination is still there, the suffering is still there, and the lessons about secrecy, about power, about the cost of nuclear weapons are still unlearned. The Mayak disaster was 100 times worse than Chernobyl in terms of long-term contamination, and it's still covered up, still minimized, still ignored. That's the truth they don't want you to know. That's the disaster that didn't make the history books, and that's the warning we refuse to heed.